Hi, friends. I am so excited to offer the Healing in Community Online Summit to you. And I'm excited you signed up. Thank you for signing up and for showing up for this conversation about collective grief and liberation. Today's interview is with me. My best friend Amy Bertain interviewed me, which felt like such a sweet experience and honor. And during my interview, I talk about why this summit, why this conversation, and why now. I share about my own experience of wading through grief in response to a dear friend who passed away in 2008. And I share about the necessity for us as a collective to make space to grieve through ritual and ceremony and connection so that we can find a pathway to liberation. I hope you enjoy the summit. There are so many amazing interviews coming up and journaling prompts that will be sent out. And please stay in touch with me. There's also a closed Facebook group as well that you can sign up for and talk with me in that Facebook group. And you can also talk with other people participating in this summit. Thank you so much for being part of this community, and I hope you enjoy the interviews.
All right, so welcome, Michelle, and I'm excited to be here with you, and I want to invite you to a little grounding meditation. So feel free to close your eyes or softly cast your gaze somewhere and just start to settle into your body. And just feel your breath and notice your breath as it moves in waves in and out of your body. Connecting to the rhythm and the constancy of the breath without judgment, just noticing the body and noticing your breath in the body. And I invite you to breathe deeply down all the way through the top of your head and all the way down through your body and out through your feet. So that with each inhale, you're bringing in cleansing breaths that connect you into the earth. And you can even visualize or imagine that there are grounding cords of whatever color speaks to you that come from the bottom of your feet and extend deep into the earth and wrap themselves deeply into the soil or the crystals or the rocks below. The earth is supporting you as the breath brings life. The breath is life. And just ask your higher self to be present with you and ask what it is that you need to remember as you speak to this audience today and share with us your heart. Just take 5 deep breaths at your own pace. Settling in deeper with each breath. And when you're ready, slowly open your eyes. Well, it is such a pleasure and an honor to interview you, Bestie, Michelle. And I want to just say, for many of us that are a part of this, how grateful we are that you have created this space. And I'm really glad that we get to hear from you in response to a lot of the same questions. So I wanted to start with, and you may do this in your intro as well, but tell us a little bit about your work in the world, what you do in the world, and who you are in the world.
Thanks for agreeing to interview me and for that sweet meditation. That was nice. Um, so I'm an activist and a yoga teacher and an author of the book Skill in Action: Radicalizing Your Yoga Practice to Create a Just World. And I have a background as a clinical social worker. Although I'm not practicing, I'm doing more intuitive healing work with clients, mostly virtually, all over the place. And I travel around the country and lead workshops focused on how to bring justice into spiritual spaces. And I also lead workshops and work with organizations to engage in race equity processes to transform how they function and to center justice work, and in particular anti-racism work. So that's a little bit about what I do. And the other part that really relates to what we're talking about today is I've started to describe most of the race equity work I do and the skill and action work as grief work, because I think most of what I'm doing is supporting people in practicing radical honesty, which means reckoning with history and how we came to be, and then really honoring the emotions that come up when we're conscious and awake, and raising our awareness. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have a conversation about grief and its connection to liberation.
So talk a little bit more about that, and talk about why this conversation is so necessary now about collective grief and liberation, and why this summit now. And I know that you're also writing a book about grief. Why now?
Um, I feel like, I mean, grief has always been present because loss has always been present individually or personally and collectively. And it seems like there's something going on, something in the air that feels really palpable and intolerable at the same time. And it feels like something's brewing, and it feels like there's also a lot of chaos and harm, and people don't necessarily have the words to describe what's in the air, or the static noise that's always present. And I think that noise, or what the air is made of, is connected to what I named about radical honesty, or a lack of radical honesty about systems of oppression and how power works and how it's harming us, the way power has been constructed. And so, certainly some of us benefit from on a material level, and maybe psychological and physical and spiritual, but not on a soul level. Some of us benefit from these systems of oppression being in place. And so I feel like grief is something that, in my experience, I was not conditioned to talk about grief, and definitely not to name collective grief,
Mm.
or collective harm or loss. And so I wanted to create an opportunity to make space for us to understand that while we are personally grieving, that there's grief all around us, and that if we don't talk about it, we can't heal. And if we can't heal or be in spaces in community to heal, then we won't experience freedom or liberation. We won't have access to it. So that's the why now. And the other piece of that is it feels urgent. I think it's always felt urgent for me. And I feel like more people understand the urgency, that I think more people are in touch with people, that are dying from the experience of oppression, and groups of people that are being harmed by oppression. And I think, I hear people talking about kids in detention centers, and kids at the border, right, split away from families, and racism that's happening, and sexism that's happening, and transphobia, and all of the isms and phobias. And I think there's more awareness. And so people feel an urgency to respond, and absent of grief, right? If we don't grieve, then I'm not actually sure we can be mindful in our response.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, because I know you hold a lot of spaces. I've been in a lot of spaces that you've held. Have you seen a change in how people are showing up, and in how they're allowing grief in those spaces?
I've noticed that when people are invited to be in a process of grieving, right, in spaces together, in workshops or ceremony or healing circles I'm in, or I'm leading or facilitating, that people are longing to grieve.
Mm.
And I think it's just dominant culture doesn't actually make space for us to do so. And it does require a slowing down a pausing. It requires us to connect with feelings.
Mm.
And dominant culture really doesn't want us to feel or notice how we feel, right? Because then perhaps we would be a different way if we actually accessed our feelings. Dominant culture wants us to be dissociated and distracted. And
Mm.
so I feel like when I invite people, when I name that I'm doing grief work, and when I invite people into the experience of noticing how they feel, they're like hungry for a space to um, have permission to feel and to express emotion, and to do that as we're navigating privilege and power, right? And um, I've noticed more and more white women actually asking about white tears in the last year,
Mhm.
which is really interesting to me. And I'm somebody that um, wants people to have the space to emote, right? So I'm never going to tell someone not to feel or express their emotions. I I feel like I want people to be mindful of how much space that takes up. And I actually think we can do both at the same time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because I think that that's an important conversation right now, especially around the acknowledgement that while we all have grief, historically there are patterns where my grief or the way that I show up in a space can silence other people's grief or can silence their ability to fully show up in a space. So
Hmm.
it's a lot to hold. Appreciate your acknowledging all of that.
Hmm.
Um, so I was going to ask you a little bit about like what does collective grief look like, but I think you sort of just talked about that. I think you sort of explained that in some of the ways. How how has grief shown up for you, and what are the lessons and the greatest lessons that grief has taught you?
So you asked me about lessons I've learned from allowing myself to grieve. I feel like that's the essence of the question. And um, I've been thinking a lot about grief. I mean, I always think about it, but specifically related to like systems of oppression, because my mother is very ill right now, and she's in the hospital, and she was in the hospital April through June in some skilled nursing facilities, and now she's back in the hospital, and I feel like watching her endure a system that was not actually made for her liberation, while also being okay if she transitions because she's suffering so much. And she's suffering because of living in a toxic culture. I feel like I'm able to be in the presence of the reality of transition and death from the experience of losing people. I think that's one lesson I've learned. Like I don't feel attached to um, people living forever or experiences going on forever. Like I feel like life has taught me how to let go, or it's led me on a journey or through an experience of having to let go. And I feel like I'm doing that some with my mom in her experience. So I feel like that lesson is about the reality that we are dying, right? Every minute of every day. And um, that we need to be mindful of how we live, right?
Yeah.
Our lives, because we're dying every minute of every day. And I don't say that to be dramatic. I just say it because it's true. It's like, and what would it be like if we acknowledge that that's happening? And um, I feel like it might change the way we relate, the way we connect with ourselves and others, the decisions we make, um, our values and beliefs. And so I feel like this lesson of letting go and an awareness that life is temporary, right? The experience of being in a physical body is temporary. And that's just real highlighted because of my witnessing my mother. I think that's the awareness of that is a lesson I've learned from the process of grieving and allowing myself to grieve. And the other lesson and experience of grief, I usually get really, two things happen when I'm grieving. One is I get sick physically.
Mm.
It's a pattern. And the other thing that happens is I feel irritable.
Mm.
Like I feel short with people. I feel like I want everyone to stop and say, what is going on? Like, are you okay? Or I want us to do that and actually it's not an or, I want us to do that on a collective scale too. Like,
Yeah.
how are we not okay? And can we actually sit with that right now? And what do we need
to be okay, or to just be in the midst of the messiness. So I think that's been my experience of holding grief, is the physical manifestation shows up first.
Mhm.
And then the irritability and emotional experience shows up second. I think that's my pattern. And so when I notice that if it's a time of year where it's an anniversary of someone's death, or this experience with my mom now, um, I need to pay attention if my physical body is giving me signs that something's going on emotionally that's tied to grief and loss.
Mhm.
So those are a few lessons and experiences. And I think the lesson in what I just shared is, um, if I'm not in tune with my emotions and feelings and this reality that loss is happening all the time, then it's likely that I'll end up feeling irritable or sick and not know why, right? And then I don't think I'm able to heal if I can't acknowledge that actually this is tied to grief. Actually, I'm sad about this, right? Which I think is a lesson not only for me, but for, I mean, I named it earlier, for us as a collective. Like if I'm not actually paying attention and noticing when something feels out of alignment, or something feels tender, or something needs attention, then it's likely I'm going to cause harm in some way. I'm going to be irritable at the person at the grocery store who's done nothing to me, right? Or irritable to my best friend or my partner, right? Or my dog who keeps wanting to go in and out of the room I'm in right now. It's like I feel like if I can just say, oh, this is grief, then
Yeah.
it's like grace shows up when I'm able to say, okay, I'm grieving. That's
Mm.
what's happening. Um, and that's a lesson I had to learn, right? Because that's only from deepening my awareness with myself and understanding when things are out of balance.
Mhm. Yeah, two things really stood out for me when you spoke about that. Many things stood out, but the things that are coming up right now is just one of the things I really appreciate, and when I've been with you in spaces, is how you do create and carve out the space that is needed for feelings. Because dominant culture doesn't give us space, as you said, right? Dominant culture says, ignore it, blow past it, keep going, keep working, keep doing, don't pay attention, don't be in the body. And I think one of the gifts that you really bring as a facilitator is the way in which you offer that space of noticing and slowing down. Um, and the other thing that I was thinking when you said even the grocery store, like as you were speaking about it, I was having that memory of every time when one is in the grocery store and the teller just says the the kind of cursory, how are you doing? And you go, oh, I'm good, even though you might be terrible, and yet our response is to shut down, close down. I don't know what we would tell the teller at that moment, but that sort of idea that we're not going to be connected to where we're really at, and we're not going to share that with other people. So I think there's a lot in what you're offering. And I wanted to ask you, because I know that you've gotten to this, but I also think that in some ways grief is, as you've expressed it to me, part of your spiritual journey. I think it's part of everyone's spiritual journey. I think it's part of being human. But I think there's something really that's really calling you to do this work in specific ways. And I wanted to ask you to just talk a little bit more about that. Like many people hold spiritual spaces, many people hold spaces or do social justice work, but you, in ways that I haven't heard many people do, are really connected to wanting to be with people in their grief or move through people's grief with them.
I I feel called to do this work because I've been in many spaces where it's been lacking, right? It's not present. There hasn't been space in social justice spheres for feeling, right, or for grieving the thing we're fighting against, or the what manifests or what is created from abuse of power and oppression. So that I've been in those spaces. I've been in spiritual spaces where I've been encouraged to just feel positive things,
Mm.
right? So not to actually walk in as a human, and because I'm a human, I'm experiencing loss, right? To leave that at the door and instead to breathe and move and transform. And I don't really think transformation can happen if I'm not able to be my whole self, full self in a space, right? But I'm invited into like feeling good, right? Being good. And maybe I just don't feel good that day. And so I think it's from the experience of, the lack of permission to acknowledge feelings and to acknowledge the grief that everyone has in their hearts. I just know they do. I know there's tenderheartedness. I know there's heartbreak. I know it's present. And I know it's present for everyone. I feel really clear about it. And I feel called to do this work because I think this is focusing on grief is a way we can transmute what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's the key to liberation, right? So I really believe that we can't experience freedom or liberation or joy, right, if we don't actually like honestly, right, experience grief and loss. And I'm not saying I want to cultivate more suffering, just to be clear with people. It's that suffering is happening anyway. And
Yeah.
then we're having an emotional response to it, right? And it's happening personally, it's happening institutionally, it's happening culturally. And I think we're aware of it. And I feel called to like carve out space for us to be with it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. And I think that's spiritual work. Like, I think that's spiritual practice, because when I'm only invited to show up as half myself, or I can only express good vibes, right, that's not spiritual practice. That's something else, I don't know, but it's not connected to spirit. And I think the other reason I feel called to do this work is because I do have a deep spiritual practice, and I do have a connection with spirit, and spirit allows me to have faith in a way that, like, the air I was talking about earlier, or that static noise, it like it like extinguishes faith, right? So my connection with spirit allows me to have faith. And I think that's why I'm inviting people in spiritual spaces, through a spiritual practice, to really feel the full range of emotions, and including grief or sadness or loss, or their response to grief and loss. And I think it's why in racial equity spaces or social justice spaces, I'm inviting people into spiritual practice, right? Because the reason people start movements is because they feel angry, and underneath that is grief, because they've lost something, or something's been taken away, or something's been denied, right? That's why we do social justice work. So I think those are some of the reasons that I feel called, why I feel called to do this work, and why my work is shifting to be more focused on grief. And the last thing is, I think there's, in dominant culture, there's an attachment to, it's interesting, there's an attachment to feeling good, but it's not real. It's like, distract yourself, or, drink a bunch of wine, or sometimes I watch a bunch of TV. It's like, do those things. And those are things you can do to take care of yourself. And they're supposed to make you feel good. And typically they make me feel worse. They take me away from what actually needs attention. And yoga, because I'm a yoga teacher, right? It can be used in the same way. This, like, okay, I'm going to show up and meditate, or I'm going to show up and move through a practice, right? And move my body as a distraction from what actually needs attention. And so I want to create something that's counter to what dominant culture is set up around what we do to make ourselves feel good.
I love that. I love that. And I think that is so powerful about what you offer, because I've heard you say often, and it's true, the only way out is through, right? And those distractions, while they might be comforting for a moment, really are not through. And I also, I've been in so many yoga spaces where something's happening in the world, and I've heard it from, Black people in particular, like, hey, there was just a shooting. Why aren't we even acknowledging that this just happened, and we're sitting in class and we're meditating, right? Or all of us, hearing about kids in cages at the border. Like, can we take a minute to just acknowledge that this is what's going on, and that we're having some feelings around it before we just plow through a practice, or, jump into a meditation? I think that even that recognizing and acknowledging allows us a minute to breathe and be present. And that's something that I've seen you do over and over. I wanted to ask you to share with us, because you were talking about your spiritual practice, and I know you have a very deep spiritual practice. What are some of the rituals and practices that you use to move through grief?
Well, I have a practice of meditating, praying, talking to spirit directly and through the natural world. It's a big practice of mine. And then I created a deck called Transverse, which you know about, which is a deck of cards, photographs, and I created the deck to help people move through grief, and to really, again, elevate this conversation about grief. And the deck's really for anyone because, as we've stated, everyone's moving through grief in some way. And so I pull a card from that deck every day, and then I have some other decks, divination decks, that I'll use. Um, and the other practice that I feel like is really connected to moving through is chanting. So I have a harmonium, and I've chanted with it and without it in moments when I felt a lot of despair. And typically I've chanted to Durga, which is the deity connected to protection of the planet, of people, this fierce maternal energy. And I feel very connected to that energy, because I think that energy connects with, how we take care of each other, right? It's collective care, how we take care of the planet. It's not just about my own individual experience, although that's important, but I'm always thinking about something bigger. And so I've found that I chant to Durga, that mama energy, and call that in times when I feel like I've been brought to my knees, that I'll just chant, because it changes the vibration, and chanting opens the heart. And I think grief can make people feel constrained, right? And actually constrict, right? I think it's because it's heartbreak, right?
Yeah.
And I think we actually need to practice opening the heart in the midst of our process of grieving. So those are some of the practices.
I think that's really kind of all of it. Practice opening the heart. Yeah, thanks for saying that.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to name, I mentioned the natural world. So there was a time, it was several years ago, where the only thing that made sense was going outside, connecting with a stream or a tree, or going on a hike and connecting with a mountain, because there's order in the natural world, and it's evident when we pay attention to it. And the actual, like, being in a physical body on this planet, trying to navigate the world, given how it's been structured for some of us to be free and others to suffer, that doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. So like that, I know how it was constructed, and it never makes sense, but the natural world always makes sense. And it's also a reminder of resilience. I mean, the mountain that's been there for hundreds of years, right? Or the tree that's been there for hundreds of years. I just think or the ocean, right? It's a reminder of how resilient we can be, and that there's strength present, even as we are grieving or experiencing suffering, that there's strength there.
And I was going to ask you to tell us about a time when you did move through grief and came out the other side, or came through, or I don't know if it's linear, or it's obviously not linear, but when you felt more freedom because of the grief process, or after the grief process, or in spite of it, or whatever, you felt more freedom emotionally, spiritually, mentally. Kind of talk to us about that process of grieving, and then actually finding more opening because of it.
I in 2008, I had a friend, his name is Eric, and he passed away. It was actually just the anniversary of his passing on Sunday. And he was a beloved of mine. He was a dear friend, and I feel like I could talk to him about anything. He was sort of like a cheerleader and like a sage, and I could tell him anything. I sought a lot of advice from him. I would call when I was in some situation and want his advice. And so he passed away he had an enlarged heart, and he passed away. Obviously, it was the anniversary just happened, so it was right after Christmas, which he celebrated, and a clot went from his heart to his brain. And the fact that he had an enlarged heart is no surprise to me. And I feel like it wasn't just physical, it was energetic, like just how big of a spirit he is and how much he shows up. And the loss of Eric devastated me. Like I'd had people pass away before, And there was something very different about his transition and passing because it was sudden, because he was 39 years old, um, because he was a beloved. And I, just wasn't expecting that to happen. That's how grief happens, right? That's how loss happens for people. Most of the time, it's not predictable, or we're not prepared for what comes after we lose someone. And so I feel like in the moments after his transition, the days after his transition, I went into sort of doing mode. Like, how do we honor him? I wrote his obituary for the paper. Like, I talked to his parents, I talked to his wife. We talked about a memorial. Like, I was in that kind of, I wasn't actually doing to distract. I was actually doing to honor him. Like, I wanted to really think about how to honor him and uplift his life. So writing his obituary wasn't actually, I mean, it was bizarre to be doing that, but it was also like, oh, he lived this life. And this is how, who he was and what he meant to me and what he meant to the community and his friends and family. And I remember there was a point after we had a few memorials. We had one in Asheville where he lived, and then we had one in my home in Carborough. That's where I lived at the time. And that's the moment when the doing stopped and the I was brought to my knees. We were standing in a circle, like in my dining room with his parents, with family, with friends of his. And that's when I was like, the gates opened and I was like, I don't know what to do. He's really not here in his physical body anymore. And I'm not surprised it happened that way. And it was, I had let everyone else like emote, right? And then all of a sudden people are like standing in the circle and of course sad, but then I was the one like, okay, this shit makes no sense to me. I'm going to fall apart now. And of course the circle, the people held me in that. So I think something I learned from that is we can rise to the occasion and we can hold people. And we actually have the capacity to do that, even though dominant culture says we don't need to make space to hold people when they're in their like moment of deep suffering or despair or sorrow or pain. That's something I learned in that moment. And I also learned about just in the, days, months, years since he passed away, he's around me all the time. Like I talk to him, I ask him questions. I have pictures of him in my home. I have a heart-shaped rock that I found the day of his memorial in Asheville. We went on a hike after. We spread his ashes in the water. We went on a hike and I found this heart-shaped rock. It's on my altar. He also shows up through deer. So deer are connected to his memorial. They showed up and sort of showed us where to put this memorial bench and plant this tree. So he shows up in that way too. And he shows up in other forms as well. And so I feel like part of what helped me move through, and I'm still moving through it because he's still present, right? The experience of grief, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, is to recognize that his spirit is everlasting. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, right? Like, and it's also, when I say that, I think about the Bhagavad Gita and Krishna saying to Arjuna, you have always been, you will always be. It's like Eric has always been and he will always be, and he's just showing up in a different form, which I think allows me to, it's what I said earlier about letting go. I think when I'm in the moments where I know, okay, I've always been and I will always be. You've always been and you will always be, right? It's not that it makes, it doesn't necessarily decrease the sorrow, and it does allow me to experience Eric in his fullest form, right? His, bigger than his body. Yeah. And that's beautiful to experience.
I agree. I mean, I think that, and that's liberating too, that things aren't as finite as we make them or as dominant. Things are bigger than we understand. Things are more mysterious than we understand. Spirits are larger than we allow. I also love in your story that you said you realize that like we can rise to the, you know, we can rise to grief, we can meet grief, and we can hold other people in their grief. And also what I heard about that circle in your living room is that you allowed yourself to be held. And I think that's a really important message, is that we can hold other people in their grief, and we can allow others to hold us in our grief. And I think that's something that we don't do a lot of times, is we think we can show up for other people, but we have trouble. Culture teaches us, don't ask, don't reach out, don't get the support.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you finally to talk about, you know, you talk a lot about that we need space and we need spaciousness to grieve. But we also need to vision what a different society would look like, right? So I wanted to ask you, what would it look like if culture gave us the space to grieve? You know, what would it look like? What would it feel like? How would we be different? And how might we vision, or what could be different if we did that?
Yeah. I think, part of it's connected to the slowing down that I mentioned earlier. So we have to change, we have to shift our focus on productivity and
Mm.
outcomes to actually be in a process,
Mm.
and to prioritize process. And grief is certainly a process.
Mm.
You know, it's an ongoing process. It's not as if there's an end point to it. Again, because we're alive in bodies, right? Experiencing what it is to be human and alive. I also, I mentioned my mom has been sick, and I just hired a patient advocate for her. And the only way I, could afford to do that is to ask for help from other people. And it's related to people holding me in my grief and me asking for help, right?
Mm.
And allowing myself to be held. People showed up. People have donated. People I've never met,
Wow.
like several people I have never met, somehow saw this post on social media and gave money, and to support my mom, to support me in supporting my mom, because she's not getting the care she needs in the system, because it wasn't designed for her to be cared for. Like, it wasn't actually created for her. And so I feel like, the pausing, the slowing down, the feeling, the listening, the supporting when we can support in whatever way, whether that's the example I gave of donating or something else, right? I think there'd be a practice of asking people how they are and receiving whatever they say,
Mm.
and making space for them to be honest about how they feel. And I feel like I think we would also have to dismantle scarcity.
Mm.
Um, I mentioned dismantling productivity, dismantling the kind of urgency that is fraught with recklessness, right? The kind of like, I don't know what to do, but I know it's urgent, so I'm going to do something, that kind of thing. I think we'd have to be more mindful.
Mm.
And I also feel like, I think the last part of this is making space for folks to feel whatever they feel. And I'll be specific. When I was at the hospital the other day, my mom was cognitively, she is having issues because of medication and perhaps the infection she has. And she had been like, not acting like herself.
Mm.
And she, asked me the same question over and over. And then she would say some things that were mean. And I actually knew she didn't know what she was saying. So it actually didn't feel personal. It wore me down. It was like grating.
Yeah.
And so I had that experience. And then I was like, I need a breather. So I left the hospital and I went to get food. And I had an experience of like, oh, these Brussels sprouts are so delicious,
Mm.
right? And 10 minutes prior, I'd been at the hospital and my mom had been like grating on me, even though she's not her intention. She's not in her right mind. And then I went back to the hospital, and I felt like I had a little more emotional reserves to be there and be present. And so I feel like, our culture needs to allow people to feel multiple things at the same time. And so often with grief, it's you're sad, you're crying, okay, and you have 3 days to do so, and now move forward. But the reality is, I can feel sad, I can feel exhausted, I can feel grateful for nourishment, right? Or a conversation or text from a friend checking in. I can feel held by the community that I mentioned that is showing up and supporting me and supporting my mom. I can have a sweet moment with my dog Jasper in the midst of that, or a phone conversation with my partner. And then I can feel devastated and despair again. And I feel like, that's part of being mindful, right? And in tune, and allowing my humanness to show up. And because humanness is connected to a full range of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And being a robot is connected to feeling one thing, right? Or not actually noticing how you feel. And I don't want to be robotic. So our culture would need to shift the conditioning around being one way and feeling one thing in response to grief. And instead, it would need to allow us to feel everything.
Mm. Is there anything else that you want to say about what collective liberation means, or anything that we've touched on in this conversation?
I think collective liberation, it's what I just said about humanness and wholeness. It's like allowing people to be in their messiness and rawness and wholeness and humanity.
Mm.
And, just by asking this question about collective liberation and the themes we've talked about today and the themes that are coming up in this summit, we have to do it together, right? So we have to get free together. Otherwise, none of us are free. And so in a culture that says, be out for yourself, focus on the individual, be competitive, that's never going to lead to liberation. It never will. It will lead to more imprisonment and disconnection and dissociation. And so I think the invitation is for us to be in this together, and for us to create conditions for everyone to thrive and to feel and to be and to grieve and to experience freedom.
Yes. Thank you so much, Michelle. Do you have any work coming up that you want to let folks know about? Kind of what's next for you, or there's this summit, or other things you want to let folks know about?
Yeah, so part of what inspired this online summit about collective grief and liberation is I'm actually co-facilitating a retreat in June, and you're one of the facilitators, and several other folks who've been interviewed are co-facilitators. It will be at Om Sanctuary, June 11th through 14th in Asheville, North Carolina. And it will be a space for us to explore some of the themes that I've talked about today in community. So we'll bring our full selves to the space, right? And our emotions, and connect and move through ceremony and connect with the natural world and move in our bodies and breathe together and connect to the ways in which we're suffering as a collective. And we'll talk and hopefully create some conditions in that space for freedom and connection and deeper intimacy. And so that's coming up in June. And then, between now and the end of 2020, I have skill and action workshops happening all over the country. And the best way is for folks to know where I'll be is to go to my website, which is michellecjohnson.com, to see the different skill and action workshops, the race equity workshops, and I offer some other workshops as well, in person and online. So that's the best way to stay in touch with me and to hear about what's coming up.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for holding this summit, and thank you for all the work that you do in the world. I'm grateful for you.
I'm grateful for you. Thanks for taking the time to interview me and yeah, to listen. And thanks for being my best friend.
Likewise.
I love you.
I love you too.